right, we're rolling.
Oh, are we?
No, we're rolling. According to this, I'm rolling. I see.
Will you edit out any egregious mistakes that I make?
I will.
All right.
That's the great thing about not doing this live. If you think you said something stupid and you want it left out, feel free to let me know.
What if I start dropping F-bombs because I drank this pumpkin ale very quickly?
Obscenities are allowed here.
Oh, okay. Oh, boy. Well, you just opened Pandora's box. Okay, there we go.
Nothing racial.
Of course, yeah.
And nothing religious. Those are really the only two rules I have for this podcast.
All right. Well, this is still
Or no politics. I keep politics out as much as I can.
Okay. Yeah.
But like I said, so just shoot me a message. I'm going to leave all of this in.
All right, great. Awesome. Let's keep it. This is the raw, unedited.
This is the raw. This is us preparing for the podcast, and I just decided to leave in. So welcome to another episode of Stories from a Bar. I am Chris Osborne, the host, of course, and for this episode, I'm hanging out with Mike Diana. I hope I said that right.
Oh, yeah, you got it.
Okay, good. I always forget to ask pronunciation of the last name before I start. I'm going to write myself a note or something. Education and Programs Manager over at the Schenectady County Historical Society. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Great, man. Great. It's Wednesday evening. It's about happy hour time. We're having some beers. I'm very excited about it.
I'm almost done with mine. We might have to.
We'll pause and grab some more beers.
All right, we have the technology. Great.
We do. So before I get into anything, I do have a little business to tend to. Got to throw a little ad out there if you don't mind. So for all the listeners out there, feel free to use the discount code STORIES for 3% off your purchase from Uptown Beverage in Schenectady over on Altamont Ave. Huge beverage center, great selection from all the local breweries that you know and love. Anything else you may be looking for, they likely have it. And if for some reason they don't, they will be happy to get it for you. So be sure to check out uptownbeverage.com and use the discount code STORIES for 3% off your any online purchase. Plus they offer delivery, which is always fantastic. It's nothing like getting beer delivered to your door.
Can I use that discount code?
Yeah, anybody that listens to the podcast.
Oh, goodness. Wow.
I know. But now on to all kinds of other stuff and the reasons we're here. And I'm very excited about this. This is the second time since I've done the podcast in 3 years that I'm doing a Ghost Stories episode. I feel like I have such a small window to do them, and then I get lazy. That once October passes, I'm like, well, there's always next year.
Absolutely. There's always next year.
But like a few years ago, I did one with Maeve McEnany Johnson from Discover Albany on Ghost Stories in Albany. That was fascinating, and I've wanted to do one on Schenectady since.
Well, we've got cooler ghosts. I think it's just objectively provable that we have cooler ghosts.
All right, we'll get into that.
Yeah, you know.
That sounds like the gauntlet's been thrown down there.
Well, it's just a friendly rivalry. You know, Albany's been living in our shadow for 300 years now. They haven't forgiven us, so.
So they're trying to claim the ghost crown, is what you're saying?
It's a contentious title. It's but sometimes you can't mess with the best.
So we're hanging out at Mad Jack Brewing at the Van Dyck here in the Stockade in Schenectady. I want to give a big shout out and thank you to them, their manager Deborah, for letting us record here in their gold room. It was very kind to them. The Van Dyck has always been one of my favorite places to stop in Schenectady. As we were having our little conversation, I'm like, one of my favorite thing about this place is the building's been here forever. The building itself, maybe since the 1800s. I think the Van Dyck, the first iteration of it, opened in like the 47 or something, 1947, as the Jazz Lounge.
Yeah, I don't actually know the history of it myself, but I do know that it goes back, that this particular building has perhaps some ghost stories associated with it as well.
Oh, and we will get into.
We will. We were just talking to the manager, Deborah, about that. So.
But just the Victorianness of this building is one of my favorite things to come see, because it's not something you see when you expect to go to a brewery or restaurant or bar. So that's why this is one of my, on top of the top-notch beers and food, of course.
My favorite thing, if I may interject,
absolutely,
is the people here. You know, we at the Historical Society work with the Van Dyck. We work with Brian, the brewer here, for a lot of the different programs that we do. And you can tell this is a great space operated by great people. And when you come here, you meet them, you get to know them a little bit better, and you just see that this is what you want to see in your own town, you know.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. And I am drinking the Mohawk Sunset IPA, which is quite delicious. This is the first time I've had this one. I had their Oktoberfest before this, and that was good.
I am finishing their Pumpkin Spice Ale. They have a longer title for it, but this is the last gulp of that.
And as I've mentioned before, I'm not into the whole pumpkin beer, pumpkin spice stuff. It's the Oktoberfest that tickle my fancy come October or September. I won't drink them before September because I feel like that's just shouldn't be allowed.
Well, I'm perfectly willing to admit that I have no taste for beers whatsoever. Typically, I'm usually a cocktail or a wine kind of person, but that goes back to my experiences in college, and that's a podcast for another time, folks. We don't want to go there.
And you want to take a little pause to grab another beer before we get into it?
Sure.
All right. All right, I think we're back.
Yeah, through the magic of technology.
The note I leave to myself to make sure the red light is on. The red light is on.
Oh, great. Fantastic.
Timer's going again, so we're good. What beer did you end up grabbing?
Now I have the Oktoberfest. That was the bartender's recommendation.
Yes.
So.
I enjoyed that one. That was my first beer. That was good.
Enjoying it, yeah.
So before we get into ghost stories, because I'm very excited to talk about those, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself in the Schenectady Historical Society for everyone that will listen to this?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in the area. Technically, I was a Guilderland kid, so that's the next town over.
Yeah.
But
In fact,
yeah.
my uncle's the soccer coach there.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Well, who's your uncle?
Coach Canali.
Oh, great. Well, I know Coach Canali very well.
Do you?
Well, maybe he remembers me. I don't know.
All right.
I kind of, fell off around 10th grade, so maybe he's forgotten all about me. I wasn't one of the varsity stars, but, if you're hearing this, Coach Canali, thanks for the good times. But yeah, so I grew up in Guilderland, and I've always loved history. Growing up, surprisingly, despite I had incredible history teachers in Guilderland High School, but it just never clicked for me that history was something that was local as well. It was always something that happened somewhere far away, European history, Roman history, or kind of even more exotic places than that. But it wasn't until I was in college, Hamilton College is where I studied. I came back to the area. And I became acquainted with the Schenectady County Historical Society just kind of in my summers, right? My time off from school, I would come and I would volunteer. And, man, my eyes were opened that this area where we live, the Albany, Schenectady, Troy area, capital region, whatever you want to call it, has really been at the crossroads of so many important events in United States history. And I think Schenectady in particular, and am I contractually obligated to say this? Yes. But is it also true? Yes. The Schenectady County Historical Society is an incredible organization for local history. It's a group primarily driven by volunteers, people from the community who really care about the mission of protecting and preserving and sharing Schenectady's history, and just so many countless hours go into it from, again, volunteers, from just regular people in the community. Of course, we also have a professional staff, and now I'm one of those supposedly professional staff members.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Yes. And I have 5 much more professional colleagues than myself. So we have a lovely little organization that I think we're able to kind of mix the capabilities of a larger organization with the heart and the soul of a smaller local organization. So we have 3 historic sites, our museum and headquarters at 32 Washington. We're just down the street from there, just here in the Stockade Historic District.
Walking distance.
Oh, absolutely. Walking distance. Absolutely. We have the Maybe Farm Historic Site just outside of town. Still technically within walking distance, but it's going to take you a
little bit of a hike.
A little bit of a hike, yeah. So that is a 1705 farmhouse, and maybe one of our more popular sites. We just had a fall foliage festival there, and we had, probably 1,500 people come on through in that day. So that was a pretty big event for us.
Nice.
I was stuck doing parking. I didn't have that much fun. And we also have recently acquired the Brower House Creative Space, which is another historic home in the Stockade, which we've opened up for artist spaces, for studios. And we have some very creative people doing some very creative things.
Oh, that's awesome.
In that house. Oh, yeah, we're having a lot of fun. That's what my job really is. It's just me having a lot of fun, and then somehow I get paid to do it. So I don't know how that works, but
let's live in the dream right
It
there.
keeps working, so I'm not going to complain.
It's funny you mentioned never thinking about your own hometown's history when, of course, you're going through school and being taught the history of literally anywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's the most important thing that people need to learn. That history is something that you can interact with, that it is, that it shapes your world and where you are and your neighbors around you. You're all a product of of history. And if you think about it in these abstract and academic terms, I'll be honest, it's boring, it's stupid, and it's irrelevant. Who cares about that kind of textbook history? History is a living, breathing narrative that we all take part in. And so if you're not, involved in it, if you're not educating yourself about the past, you'll just have other people tell you what to think, and you'll believe it, and you won't have a leg to stand on.
That's true. Honestly, not until I got older did I really start looking into Schenectady history and stuff like that. And we're going to get into some of that for some of these ghost stories because of the massacre and everything.
Oh, we sure are, yeah.
I'm sure the word massacre catches people's attentions when they hear that. Oh, yeah. But I say we start talking about some ghosts, man.
Oh, absolutely. We can absolutely do the ghost stuff.
Let's start off. We'll go down the road just a little bit. I've come across like 2 stories from down the road, and then a couple stockade specific, because this was the stockade was, of course, the site of 1690, a large massacre.
Yeah, that was the massacre of 1690. It's kind of like the Freebird for our organization. Leonard Skinner's Freebird. I'm always telling this story, and it's a very interesting story. It's an engaging, dramatic story, which is kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, people will pay attention to it. On the other hand, kind of like a game of telephone. If you play that when you're a kid, you start saying one thing, and then by the time it goes around the circle from, mouth to ear, all the way back around, it's somehow changed and morphed into something completely different. So it's a story that gets told and retold, but not necessarily the most grounded and historical approaches are taken.
I don't think that's a surprise. But we'll get into that a little bit.
Sorry.
Why don't we start with... you mentioned in one of your emails the most famous.
Oh, yeah.
The story of Alice Vanderveer.
Yeah. Alice Vanderveer. Well, I can tell you the story, and then I can deconstruct it.
Because as I was doing my research, of course, everything I come across says there's, of course, various iterations, but they all have the general consensus of the overarching theme there. But yeah, tell me.
Yeah, no matter what version, it never really has a happy ending, does it?
No.
Wow. Well, I'll get into, I guess this is my version, synthesized and distilled from all the various versions that I've been exposed to. So this is the story of
Speaking
Alice.
of the telephone game.
Yeah, the story of Alice Vanderveer, as I understand it. So we're going to go back to even before the massacre. We're not quite massacred yet.
No, so around 1672.
1672 is the date that is associated with this story.
Okay.
For some reason. I don't know why. But 1672, Schenectady was a small little outpost on the fringes of the British Empire. The majority of the population was Dutch, hence the name Vanderveer and all the other Dutch names that you might encounter throughout this podcast. But it's a very small place. Everyone kind of seems to know everyone, and they're on this far-flung reaches of this colonial world. Surrounding the town would be pine forests as far as the eye can see. Schenectady was, of course, the place beyond the pines. It's in the name, and it's
also
in the movie
that
it's
came
in the
out.
movie too. Yeah, so you can't forget that. Now,
I like to tell people Ryan Gosling robbed my bank.
Oh yeah, that's true. I that's a very creative way to put it. I gotta remember that.
There you go.
So Alice, who is Alice? Well, according to the legend, Alice is a young, fetching woman. Kind of suitable marriage age at the time. Her father, however, was kind of a miserly, jealous old man, a real controlling and vindictive person. And despite Alice's popularity with all the young lads here in Schenectady, that he would not suffer to have his daughter courting any of them, because according to him, no man in Schenectady was good enough for his daughter.
You know, it's funny. I feel like right off the bat, that makes the story relatable because of all like the dad jokes that you always hear about never letting their daughters date until, they're like 30 or something like that.
This is like
so I think that helps catch. I think that probably helped catch the story catch on.
Oh, absolutely. No matter how bad your prom experience was, it's not as bad as Alice Vanderveer's prom experience. She had it a little bit rougher. Because back then, law and order was more of a concept than a series of institutions. So all the eligible young bachelors stayed away from Alice Vanderveer, despite her beauty, her reported good nature and charms. It wasn't just physical. She was apparently a very nice lady as well. I don't know. I never met her. Nevertheless, Alice... she put up with her dad's controlling nature. The Vanderveer family supposedly lived in a little cabin just outside of the town, just on the outskirts of town, somewhere out in the woods there. And somehow, some way, she catches the eye of one young gentleman in particular who's not dissuaded by Alice's father's threats and his swagger. And this gentleman starts to court with Alice in secret, and she finally starts to break away from her controlling father, sneaking out in the middle of the night while he's fast asleep to meet with this young suitor and go for midnight strolls or... I don't really know what they did back in the 17th century to date. I don't
1672 was probably a different level of scandalous than it was the level, these days.
First base, second base, I don't know what that means in 1672. But nevertheless, it was getting pretty serious between the two. Alice was probably starting to think that she would have to tell her father what was going on, but as fate would have it, she didn't have to, because at some point... her dad catches on to the secret liaison, and he starts to follow Alice. One fateful night, he follows her as she sneaks out of the home. He follows her at a distance with his trusty musket in hand because he knows that something is going on. And when he sees his daughter and this young suitor, this impudent young man, canoodling there along the riverside.
I like that word.
Yeah, it's the most PG word I can think.
Yeah.
I don't know what they were up to back then. I don't even know what canoodling actually means, but I think it applies here. By the riverside, he is furious, and so he levels that musket, and without a warning, without any chance of this young man getting away, Mr. Vanderveer pulls the trigger. A shot rings out in the night, breaking the silence of this small little town, and the young suitor falls dead right there. Now, Alice, of course, is horrified to see her lover slain before her very eyes, and she is immediately hysterical, screaming, crying, "Oh my goodness, what has happened?" So her dad approaches her and starts yelling at her for how duplicitous she's been, and how could you do this to me? Because apparently this was some injury against him or something like that.
Of course,
it's a pretty dramatic, ugly scene. Again, it's pretty gross, but the town is waking up because they heard the gunshot, they hear the yelling, and they are all kind of gathering together to figure out what is going on. Because again, back then there are no police. The justice was dispensed the old-fashioned way. A mob would form, decisions would be made, and people would pay the price.
Oh,
right?
The good old mob days.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, I can go back to the mob days. That's what we're missing here in modern-day America. Yeah. Nevertheless, they grab their pitchforks and torches or whatever cartoonish scenario you might want to imagine, and they all descend upon the river where Alice and her father are still, arguing. He's trying to pull her away back home so that they can flee the scene, but she's not going anywhere, staking by the side of her fallen young love. And so the townspeople quickly surround the two. They see the situation. They see old Mr. Vanderveer there with his musket. They see the dead man, and they put two and two together. They figure out what happened. Mm-hmm. And again, as we said, mob justice. If one thing you can say about it is it's efficient. They quickly apprehend.
They generally accomplish their goal.
Yes, very, very quickly. They
especially back then.
Back then, yes. No red tape, no bureaucracy, no appeals. They grab Mr. Vanderveer. They drag him to the center of town, where apparently they erect a stake, tie him to it, and burn him right there at the stake. So Jan Vanderveer goes up in flames that night to pay for his crimes. Now, Alice, of course, she probably wasn't too happy with her dad at that point in time, but she's still horrified further by seeing now her father being burned alive before her very eyes. And this is all just too much for the young lady. She wants to get away, and who can blame her? She wants to run, and so she does. She runs away from the scene. She flees this horrible scenario in front of her, and she heads out towards the east part of town. Now, when the mob sees her trying to get away, they come to some pretty rash conclusions that, well, perhaps she had more to do with this than, they previously thought. Perhaps she was not just a hapless victim here, but in fact an evil seductress, a temptress, if you will, that had led that young man to his untimely demise. I mean, that makes sense to me, right?
Yeah, obviously. Isn't that all women?
Did you see the way she was dressing? That dress.
Back in 1672?
You could practically see her ankles in that dress.
I was going to say an ankle-related joke.
Well, I shouldn't laugh because the mob starts pursuing Alice as she blindly flees. She heads out of the stockade wall, this little palisade that once surrounded the small town, flees out the eastern gate into, again, the forests beyond. And we're talking about, even if you were to get to where Erie Boulevard is today, you would find thick, heavy woodland, and she's fleeing through this dark and wooded environment with no destination in mind. She just wants to get away. And now the mob, again, torches and pitchforks in hand, are pursuing her as she flees. And supposedly she gets past the plain, past the great flats, and up into the hills above the flats there, up into the hills where, unfortunately for her, she trips down a little embankment and into a small little stream, the Cowhorn Creek, which still flows today. And she trips into the stream, and, well, at that point in time, horrified, terrified, and now injured, she just kind of gives up on just about everything. And it's in no time at all that the mob catches up to her. They apprehend her and tie her to a tree and give her the same treatment as as her father.
Jeez,
they burn her alive right there at well, not at the stake, but at the tree. And apparently Alice was so defeated and so just broken by the events of that night that even as they tied her to the tree and set the kindling alight, that she offered no cry or no protest. And even as the flames started to consume her, she just sat there, or hung there really, silent as she burned alive.
It's crazy how many stories end with people being burned at the stake.
Yeah, there must be some kind of anthropological conclusion to be drawn there. There must be something going on.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. But supposedly the little copse of trees, the stream where Alice met her end, is today, if you know where Jackson Gardens is.
Yep.
Union College campus.
Right, so right down the road from here, again, walking distance.
Oh, absolutely. Apparently it's the very same stream that you can kind of walk alongside today if you are a Union College student, or even if you're just a member of the community. You can go out there and you can see it for yourself.
I've been drunk wandering around that campus at night.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I never have.
I didn't go there.
I've never been that much fun. I hear they have good parties at Union
I vaguely
College.
remember falling in a bush.
Oh, all right. Well, there you go. That's half of Alice's story right there.
I know. There you go.
It's a good thing there was no mobs back then.
Half the college experience.
I think so. So, supposedly, again, if you ask certain Union College alum, or maybe even some students today, I don't know, I'm not cool enough to party with college kids anymore, but apparently there are some strange phenomena that kids experience. Certain moonlit nights.
I definitely found stories, or like one guy's like some historian related to the college, like she never existed, can't find proof. And then of course you have the stories from the people that experience stuff.
Yeah.
One woman, I forgot her name, and I didn't write it down in my notes, but
Neither did I.
She said she researched it for a long time, trying to find some kind of sign. She had someone come to her once that talked about being basically picked up and thrown across.
Oh dear.
The courtyard there, or the garden.
Huh.
Or something like
well,
that.
That's
But
something.
from what I could find, according to the legend, it's basically on the first full moon of summer, her ghost reappears at the garden looking for her lover.
Supposedly.
Is
Yeah.
that
Again, trying forever to, reunite with her lover or something like that, something tragic like that. And she's never going to quite accomplish her goal, except if her goal is to spook some college kids. Can I be honest, Chris?
Yes,
I've looked into
absolutely.
the story, of course, because I've had to tell it. I've had people ask me about it. I've never even seen too much evidence of an Alice Vanderveer in the first place. Am I ruining the immersion?
No, I don't. I think that's a valid argument. I mean, seriously, how good were records from 1672, right?
They're pretty limited. Basically, what you're looking at is whatever was recorded in the local church. And at that point in time, 1672, if that's when Alice was alive, the nearest church would have been in Albany. The Dutch Reformed Church of Albany would have been keeping track of births, baptisms, marriages, and deaths. And that is your demographic knowledge for this time period.
What makes it weird is this story took off, from what I could tell. Like you mentioned in your email when we were conversing back and forth there, it was basically the most famous ghost story in the general area.
Yes,
like Life magazine had the 2-page spread in it in like the 1950s or something like that.
Yeah, it had a bit of popularity in the mid-20th century. And I think a lot of that may have even been related to I guess there was a movie. This is before my time, folks. There was a movie that was shot on location.
1991, I believe.
Well, I know of The Way We Were.
Yep.
1973.
Was it Robert Redford and
Barbara Streisand.
It wasn't Michelle Pfeiffer.
I don't even know who Michelle Pfeiffer is. I don't know my celebrities. I barely know who Barbara Streisand is. But apparently that was shot there, and that kind of correlates to this boom in popularity for this story because it was somehow a recognizable location from that movie. And just kind of goes to show that sometimes the meta history plays as much to our understanding of the past as the actual documentable facts of the case.
Like I said, we were talking about ghosts and stuff before this. I'm not 100% either way on whether or not I believe in ghosts. I enjoy the stories. I kind of want to believe, but at the same time, I'm also incredibly skeptical. Yeah. Stories are always so entertaining to me, especially one like this. It's the experiences I like hearing about more than anything. Like the stories are super interesting.
Oh yeah.
Last time I went down to Charleston, I did a ghost walking tour, and they had some real fun stuff that they pointed out. Like we walked by this one tiny cemetery. They talked about someone took a Polaroid or something and supposedly captured a ghost. The story was this woman had lost her child really early on. She goes to the cemetery to mourn it every year on its birthday or something like that. I don't remember. This was years ago now. I guess at the time, Polaroid had a department that actually analyzes these pictures. Oh. And they're like, we can't disprove this. Of course, we can't tell you it's a ghost, but we also can't say that it was a malfunction of your camera or anything like that.
Interesting. Huh. Well, that's quite a story. And we get that sometimes on our ghost tours. We have people taking photos, and they'll come up with some strange artifacts in their photos, and they'll send them to us, and we kind of shrug our shoulders. And I guess it really does come down to your interpretation. I'll share. I will confess that while personally I'm a bit of a skeptical person, I enjoy the stories as well. You see, I have a bit of a different kind of burden as a historian here with the Historical Society that I have to kind of.
Thank you.
Ooh, wow, look at this. Goodness.
Oh, thank you so much.
All right, well, we are getting some fantastic food right
Absolutely.
now.
Thank you, Deborah, so much.
And, oh, man, that's just exactly what I had in mind. But I do have this kind of methodological burden because every other month of the year, people rely on me to provide, hopefully, to the best of my ability, factual and reasonable interpretations of Schenectady's past. So when I tell these stories, I kind of have to toe the line between indulging in the story itself and also offering some kind of historical, provable context.
Well, I mean, you want to assume that most of these stories are based off real events. Like we talked about the massacre. We'll get into that a little more.
Oh, yeah.
But let's move on. We talked about that being like the most famous story to come out of the general area. There's also, I came across Vale Cemetery, which is also down the road. Some stories about there, and I just want to touch on this because it came up a couple times. Open since 1857. I don't know if it's still the largest cemetery in Schenectady. It may be. I'm not sure.
It's pretty big. I can tell you
it's pretty huge. But from what I was reading, like there's been people have heard statues crying or even seen them bleeding. Like out of the eyes. That seems like a kind of typical story when it comes to like graveyard stories. I feel
like. And one thing that I have heard, maybe not recently, but when Vale Cemetery was first opened. This is part of a kind of a countrywide rural cemetery movement. And again, you wouldn't think of Vale Cemetery being particularly rural because it's in the heart of downtown. But suffice to say, when it was built, it was very rural. The original Dutch churchyard, where the first burials in Schenectady had taken place. It was kind of sandwiched between Front Street and Green Street over by the little circle with the Lawrence statue, a pretty popular landmark. Well, that cemetery there was exhumed, and all the bodies were relocated to Vale Cemetery. And apparently, when those bodies were disturbed and reinterred, some of the bodies, the spirits, if you will, were not terribly happy with having been moved from where they wanted to be.
Imagine that.
Yeah, right? You're taking these people off.
It's not eternal rest when you wake them up to move them.
Absolutely, right? Wouldn't you be mad? Today you got to pay an arm and a leg to get a good burial spot, right?
Yeah.
That's money you got to pay. And so apparently the few homes surrounding the cemetery reported some very strange occurrences in the aftermath of that relocation. Of course, I wasn't there, so I can neither confirm nor deny.
Of course.
It's the kind of story that comes up.
Yeah. But the most interesting thing I found on Vale Cemetery, there's apparently an abandoned small church or something on the property when people talked about hearing like ghostly choirs saying it come from the church. Now that creeps the shit out of me.
That sounds like a lot of fun. I'm going to go there tonight and find out. One thing I can say about Vale Cemetery is it certainly evokes that mood, you know. There's the cemetery part, you know, kind of on top of the hill there, and it's pretty easy to navigate around. There's some beautiful monuments up there. But then as you go down the hill into a little hollow, there's a stream that flows at the bottom there. And I'm not really sure what the rationale is or why this is the case, but there's these mausoleums that follow down the hill, and they look quite decrepit and abandoned. And that's, you know, definitely the spookiest part of the cemetery for me is when you kind of go down there.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of under tree cover, so there's really no one around there. So it's, for me, I think the most evocative part of the whole place.
Interesting. Well, let's talk about some stockade-specific areas, since that's where we're actually hanging out.
Oh, yeah.
And it probably seems appropriate to start with the Van Dyck here.
Oh, sure.
As we were talking to Deborah, the manager. So, like I said, I've spent 38 years old. I've spent 33 of those years in Schenectady. Moved to South Carolina when I was like 15, came back at 20 or 21. So basically all my drinking years I've spent in Schenectady. So I'm very versed in the Van Dyck.
Indeed.
And the Mad Jack over that span.
As you should be.
And I've heard a lot of stories about this place since then. I've had a friend that was a bartender here years ago. I've had other friends that have worked here kind of on and off briefly. A lot of the stories came out of the kitchen. But everything, I can never find like a lot of details on what happened here. The most I can find is that somewhere in the 1800s, I talked about this building being old, and it still has the Victorian look all in it. Somewhere in the 1800s, this place was a brothel, and one of the women was murdered on the staircase. That's kind of the extent of the information I can find. Yeah,
and that's honestly the extent of the information that there really is. It's kind of one of these apocryphal stories, and it's it's a story that I've heard. I've heard that the ghost of this woman still occupies the building. And she's particularly jealous. She fancies living men in the space, and she'll appear to them. But when living women are around, she gets kind of jealous and petty about it, perhaps even dangerous to be around.
Well, Deborah mentioned having a bridal party here, and one of the women thought she tripped on the stairs.
That she did say that.
Yeah.
That's we can neither confirm nor deny. It was a bridal shower after all.
Bridal shower.
Weird stuff.
We don't know. Yeah, I have not attended a bridal shower, so I have
also never been to a bridal shower.
I'm sure they're a lot less wild than I imagine.
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
Or want to imagine, but yeah, that fascinates me still, and that's a story I even enjoy telling if I run into someone that hasn't been here before or hasn't heard it before. I'm like, if this place was, burlesque stuff going on and someone was murdered.
Well, it's the world's oldest profession, so
hey, there you go.
Not murder. I mean, that's a close second.
I mean, murder's pretty old, I would suspect.
What do you think came first, the prostitutes or the murderers? No, that's a weird question. I don't edit that one out. Yeah,
I think we leave that in, and that's what I named the episode. What came first, prostitutes or murder?
It's philosophical. I think there's a lot to unpack there.
I would say it's probably safe to say murder.
Probably.
I feel like murder was around longer than prostitutes.
I guess so.
But that was all the information I could find on the Van Dyck. Certainly don't let that stop you from coming here, as Deborah brought us some delightful little fried treats here, and they are delicious.
I'm enjoying this right now.
So if you hear chewing, I apologize and also don't care because I'm hungry. But Front Street Park. So when you're doing the ghost tours and stories like that, obviously it's October. I'm going to put this episode out hopefully next weekend.
Okay.
Like I said, I feel like I have a limited time when I wanted to do this ghost story window. Like if I can't do it in October, I feel like I shouldn't do it. So I'll force myself to get this out by next weekend. But we talked about let's start with the massacre, because I feel like the following couple stories I just jotted down kind of resemble that. So Front Street Park's just down the road from here, literally right on the river, right?
Yeah. Well, I usually know it as Riverside Park.
Riverside Park. I saw Riverside Park. I saw Front Street Park. referred to a couple different ways.
It is a park on Front Street.
Yes. So from what I could come across, it's said to be haunted by the spirits of former British settlers, the first ones that were here. I think they were killed by the French and Native American soldiers during the Schenectady Massacre. Is that?
Well, yeah. So this is one of those stories that whether you believe the ghost stuff or not, there's so much like real horrible stuff that it still send a shiver down your spine.
Stuff is kind of based in.
Absolutely. Honestly, it's sometimes truth is more strange and more shocking than any fiction could ever possibly be. So the massacre of 1690, if I were to tell you the whole story, would probably take up the rest of the podcast. But suffice it to say that back then you have these colonial struggles for power and for resources. And here the major resource was beaver pelts.
I can edit that out.
Oh, well, there you go. Believe it or not, a whole colonial world driven by the struggle for beaver pelts and their exportation. So to make a very long story very short, you have two alliances, the Mohawk or Haudenosaunee alliance with the British here in where we are down in New York, and then up north in modern day Canada, of course, you had the French colony up there and various Native American peoples kind of in the orbit of that French colony. And in these two alliances, the Canadians and the New Yorkers, so to speak, had been kind of at each other's throats for about a century at this point. And each had reasons to be kind of aggrieved and, hostile towards their adversaries. Suffice it to say, this is all kind of coming to a head in 1690, that some French militiamen, some French-Canadian militiamen, and some native Canadians were on the seeking revenge for an earlier attack, and they decided to take out their vengeance on Albany. And
just the idea of Canada trying to seek vengeance and being angry. Kind of amuses me.
Well, they've turned a corner, as I understand. Not a vengeful people today, but maybe when they hear me and patronizingly talk about them, maybe they'll return to their vengeful ways.
Come down with their hockey sticks.
Absolutely, their hockey sticks and their poutine. See, if we had some gravy and some,
it's true. We have some fries. We don't have the gravy
fries,
though, but I don't care for poutine.
We're close.
Yeah. Although I'm sure that's blasphemy to them. So
yeah,
maybe I'll edit that out.
But they walked. They walked in the middle of February from Montreal down Lake Champlain, down Lake George, down the Hudson River, the upper Hudson River.
That's insane because if you make having driven to Montreal for a bachelor party, it's basically a 3-hour drive from this area. So walking that is crazy.
Through the snow.
Jeez.
And the wind and the rain, all that nastiness that February brings. And when they got to, let's say around where Half Moon, New York would be today, they had to make a decision because they were exhausted from this long journey. And Albany was a bit too difficult a target to try to take. So instead, they tried to attack the smaller, less defended town of Schenectady. And Schenectady wasn't really well defended at all for a variety of reasons. But all you need to know is that the stockade wall that was supposed to protect these folks, the gates to it were completely unlocked, and the attackers were able to infiltrate the city. The guard that was supposed to be around, 13 guys from Connecticut, it's a long story, they were asleep too, so thanks, Connecticut, you let us down again. And the invaders, they infiltrate the town, and at the given signal, the attack begins. And again, to imagine the actual documentable horror of the night is... it's something pretty shocking. Again, people being killed in their own homes before they have a chance to really wake up and dress themselves, arm themselves, see what's going on. The people of Schenectady have no chance. Doors are being broken down, people dragged out into the streets, many of them killed, some lucky enough to be captured instead. Basically, out of a population of less than 200 people, you have 60 people killed, another 24 or so captured.
And then they, on top of burning down most of the buildings, right?
Oh, yeah. And they were getting a little bit wild. In fact, these attackers had specific orders not to burn down the Dutch church. And they did it anyway. And they killed the priest there, the minister there. So they got really carried away. They were mad about something, you can tell.
Oh, yeah.
So the whole of the town is burned to the ground with maybe a handful of buildings surviving. So many people are forced to flee to Albany, and you basically have to hit the reset button on the entire town as it was.
That's crazy.
And that is the real horror of the night, and we have some stories that kind of relate to this massacre. There's this story that comes to us from the late 19th century. apparently there was an old cobbler here in the stockade living.
I came across this one.
You
too,
came across this one?
I'll see
Oh,
if this is the same one.
It's a fun one. This one has a happy ending.
Okay,
folks.
yep, this is the same one.
Okay, yeah. So he's out sitting on his stoop, as you do back in the day. There was no Netflix back then, so what else are you gonna do?
Imagine that.
Yeah, and the world was changing around this old cobbler. The city of Schenectady was industrializing. People didn't really need their shoes made by hand anymore. Things were changing, and so the man was in dire economic straits. I can tell you that much. And so he's on one dusky evening. He's on his stoop when this mysterious cloaked figure approaches him. From out of nowhere, seemingly just appears from the corner of his perception, and walks up to him, approaches him, and beckons for the cobbler to follow. The cobbler is terrified and chooses not to follow this strange figure, whomever it is, and the figure eventually leads off to one direction and disappears around a corner.
It's kind of hard to blame him.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know what I would do in that
Stranger
situation.
danger, folks. Don't follow. Again, you're going to be tempted by this story to maybe follow cloaked strangers. The PSA, don't do it, guys. It's weird and not safe. But the cobbler relates the experience to his wife, and the wife perhaps has a little bit more pizzazz than he does, because she encourages him that the next time the stranger, this cloaked figure, appears, that they should follow him and see, what's the worst that could happen.
Probably only death, but
Yeah, right? That's the worst that can happen. So, a little bit later, again, cobbler's sitting out on his stoop, and the cloaked figure appears. And, well, this time he calls his wife, and together they go and they follow this figure as the figure leads them around the corner into a little alleyway, points down to the ground at its feet, and without a word disappears. Of course, they're very startled to see this apparition disappear before their eyes. But the cobbler and his wife, they go and grab a shovel, and they dig at the spot indicated, and they find, supposedly, a pot or a cache of gold coins, of guilders, solid gold, which supposedly, apparently, date to the massacre. This was, again, as the story goes, a victim of that massacre, and all that they could do.
Just to verify, the ghost didn't look like a leprechaun, right? There was no mention.
No, I don't think. It wasn't wearing green. You see, if it was wearing a green cloak, then scientifically it would be a leprechaun, but not the case. So they dig this up, and apparently this was the spirit of someone who, on the night of the massacre, all they had time to do was bury their hoard, their accumulated worldly possessions, this cache of gold that they had of Dutch guilders, before they too were struck down by the invading dastardly Canadians. And dastardly Canadians, folks, you heard it from me, folks. First.
It's so ridiculous.
Yeah, it kind of is. But so apparently the spirit deemed this unfortunate cobbler a worthy successor, a worthy inheritor of this cache of wealth. And supposedly they lived happily ever after. But
well, kudos to him.
Yeah, right. See, just again, folks.
So the lesson is, if you see an apparition, follow it.
Yes, that nothing bad can happen to you. Only good things.
You're going to get some
happen
gold.
You will. It's certain. Read more about this in my 10-step book, How to Get Rich Without Even Trying.
Find a ghost and follow it. Step 1 through 9.
Yes. Dig. That's step number 8. You got to dig.
Well,
a lot of people forget to dig.
I was going to say that was step 10.
Oh, okay. Well, I feel like step 10 would be buying stock, but I don't know. You got.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to make it 11, you can make that 11 steps.
I might have to revise this book. I might have to
invest your gold,
yes.
Your newfound wealth that you have just dug up from the ground.
In Bitcoin. No, don't do that.
Another one of the stories I came across, again, I don't know what you guys talk about on your haunted ghost tours. I know they're very popular and certainly well worth it. 4 South Church Street, which is, I believe, right down the road that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I came across this story that talked about there's the sound of like somebody pacing in a room 22 paces.
Oh, yeah. Now, this story brings us to the late 1870s, that decade. And a man named Henry Horstmeyer had recently purchased that property. And so he's, very excited to have purchased this property. It's a beautiful home. It really is. If you come and see it today, it looks exactly as it would have done, or pretty similar to how it would have done in the late 19th century. So it has that Victorian appearance. It's a beautiful, beautiful home. I think it's apartments now. I don't actually know that for sure.
I'm not sure. Henry Horstmeyer, from what I could find, he owned the house back in 1870. So
yeah. So when he purchases the home, as he moves in, he's alarmed one night to hear the sound of footsteps in his living room. There he is in his bedroom, in his bed, and in the middle of the night he hears these footsteps pacing back and forth. And of course, the first thing he concludes is that someone has broken into his home. And a little bit concerned and intimidated by that, he stays in his room and waits for the sound of the footsteps to dissipate. And it takes an eternity for them to go away. You know, he doesn't hear any other sounds. He doesn't hear the sound of moving furniture or opening drawers as if this were a thief. You'd think they would be taking something. You think he'd be able to hear that. But what he does notice, with a rhythmic precision, these footsteps walk one way, 18 paces. Sorry, 22 paces.
22.
22
Get it right,
paces.
friend.
I'm sorry. The numbers were never my strong suit. That's why I'm a history major. But 22 paces in one direction, pause, turn around, 22 paces in the opposite direction. For an interminable period of time, Henry is there kind of cowering in his bed sheets there, waiting for this intruder to go away. Now, eventually, as the light of dawn breaks, the footsteps subside, and Henry, cautiously, carefully, peeks into his living room to find out, what did he lose? What had this intruder taken? And he sees nothing disturbed at all. The whole of the house, not just the living room, but every other room, is completely undisturbed. There's no sign of a forced entry. There's no sign of a hasty exit. So he's very concerned. He's very confused. Perhaps he was just imagining things. But lo and behold, a few nights later, the same phenomenon happens again. So one of these mornings, Henry actually inquires about it. He tries to find a carpenter to look up beneath the floorboards. Maybe there's some rot. Maybe there's some structural problem with his brand new house, and that's what he's hearing. But there is no earthly explanation to be found. The carpenters return nothing. And so he's very upset about this. He's very concerned. And he's asking around. And older residents, people in the neighborhood, they tell him a story. They tell him a story about a young boy who, during the early stages of the Civil War, wanted to sign up to join the Union Army. And of course, the Civil War is a very real event and a very real horrific event as well. Yep. And there's plenty of horror stories that we could tell you related to that. Plenty of Schenectady men who go off to fight and eventually, unfortunately, perish in battle in this very climactic phase of American history. Now, this boy, being too young for military service and kind of being a bit shorter than most, a bit smaller in stature, you might say, despite his enthusiasm and his desire to fight for the Union cause, even the desperate Union recruiters are unwilling to take him. Until the casualties mount and the Union Army is depleted and in ever need of more recruits, and eventually the recruiters become desperate enough that even this small young boy, again too young to really join the military, is accepted into the ranks of the Union Army. And now he's gotten what he wants, but the anxiety starts to set in because he knows that he's going into a very, very deadly conflict. So the night before he's about to ship out and head on his way to be deployed, he's nervous. He's pacing. He paces up and down the length of that living room. And again, being shorter than most, an average male, Henry himself, as he paces through that living room, it only takes him 18 steps to get from one side to the other. But because this boy was smaller than most, it would take him 22 one way and then 22 the other. And again, the neighbors recount, they tell Henry that they had heard this young boy pacing back and forth on that fateful night before he went away. And the boy, apparently, the next day, after his long, anxious pacing in his home, was shipped out, made his way to Gettysburg, where he was never seen or heard from again, presumed killed in the crossfire. And perhaps it is that Henry Horsemeyer was encountering that spirit, forever doomed to pace
that room.
The last night of peace that he had before his life became shattered by this deadly, deadly conflict.
That's insane.
It sure is.
It's crazy. I mean, like, these stories are born from like such logical, understandable situations.
Oh yeah. And there's even more to unpack. I understand that after this story kind of became popular here in Schenectady, apparently there was like a little Scooby-Doo mystery associated with this house as well.
Was it really?
Yeah, again, I can't really cite my sources here, but I understand that there was a kind of a prankster who had heard of this story and then like dressed in a white sheet and would chase people around the area in the late 19th century, or maybe the early 20th. I can't quite recall, but he would just chase people around. It was just some random dude.
Yeah, if you did that now, you'd just get punched.
You just get shot, is what you would. You
Yeah.
can't
Yeah.
even. Yeah. So, nevertheless, there's more to the story, perhaps even than I can recall, as I eat my potato fries.
Yes. We got some fries, some potato fries, some onion rings. Thank you, Deborah, again for that was delicious as we snack on these.
I'm gonna take the last onion.
Oh, you are welcome. I would feel like a jerk if I took the last one. So, I have one other story. I don't know what stories. Was there one in particular you wanted to bring up before I even mentioned this one? I'm curious to see if it's the same.
I do have one.
Okay.
This is the story of one Captain Banker, and it comes from the Revolutionary War.
Okay, I don't know this one.
You don't know this one? All right. Well,
I did not find this.
Yeah, this one is kind of an advanced level ghost story. This one, actually, again, one of our great volunteers, one of our great members, shared this with me, and I don't know that it's actually like in our walking tours, for instance, our candlelight tours. I don't think you'll hear this story. So this is a podcast exclusive, folks.
That's right.
There you go.
All about the exclusives.
Yes. This is the story of one Captain Banker and the apparition of Lieutenant Peters. So this takes us to the Revolutionary War. And again, this is another situation where the real-life events are horrific enough that you don't even necessarily need the ghosts to make it spooky. But the revolution here in Schenectady was, in many cases, as much of a civil war, a civil conflict, as it is an anti-colonial war, because you have a lot of people around here, and west of here as well, who just as much as people wanted to be free of the British Empire, there were plenty of people who wanted to stay part of the British Empire, loyalists or Tories, as we call them. And although Schenectady generally favored the Patriot cause and the kind of the powers that be adhered to the Patriot cause, there were plenty of loyalists around here. And west of here, you had loyalist militias operating out of, well, what is kind of today Canada or Montgomery County. They would do a lot of raids on the western side of this colonial frontier. And so there was almost a period of constant conflict, even after the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. You think that would be the final end to the British threat here in New York, but that's far from the case. After that battle, militias operating out of Canada would just wage smaller raids and attacks on Patriot-aligned settlements. It was a time to settle old scores, and sometimes the reason that you were a Patriot or a loyalist was not because you cared what Thomas Jefferson had to say or the King of England had to say, but because you really hated that guy down the street, and he stole your cows, 2 years ago, and now's your time to get revenge. Sometimes, folks, the things that inspire great changes are just petty and simplistic human nature.
Well, yeah, you're not wrong.
But I digress. So Schenectady is here in this frontier, and as the outlying settlements, the western settlements, are pushed further back, and refugees are pouring from points westward into Schenectady. Schenectady and Albany kind of remain the bastion of patriot strength in the upper part of New York. The Schenectady militia always had to be prepared to be deployed to respond to any of these raids should they take place. And that's where Captain Banker comes in. He was the captain of the local militia here. He was a well-respected officer. He had seen conflict before. He was a pretty unshakable guy, so he kind of knew what was up. And one day, this is in 1780, he hears reports from an Oneida scout. Again, the Oneida had been refugees of the conflict as well, chased from their own home villages by these loyalist and even Iroquoian militias that had chased them from their own village. The Oneida Scouts report that there is a raiding party heading towards Ballstown, or today we call it Boston, right? Like Boston Spa, like that kind of neck of the woods.
Yep.
But Ballstown was under threat. And so
Stop
Captain...
calling that Ballstown now.
Ballstown, yeah, it's kind of an awkward name again. Ballstown, I don't know. It was named after, well, some guy named Ball purchased the patent to the town and decided to name it after himself. I guess it cost him an extra barrel of rum to get the naming rights to the town. I
Is
don't
that
know.
all?
That's an apocryphal little factoid there, folks. Don't take
right.
that for granted. But I did read it, so it must be true.
Absolutely.
So he, Captain Banker, I should say, summons his most trusted lieutenant. Lieutenant Peters was his name, to take about 40 men, 40 Schenectadians and 40 Oneida auxiliaries, and go north to Ballston to investigate and perhaps, hopefully, protect the town. So they go off, and Lieutenant Peters has orders, of course, to send runners back at regular intervals to report on the progress of this mission. And the day goes on, and the day goes on. It goes, from morning to noon to getting into the evening, and no reports have come back. So Captain Banker's getting a little bit concerned. He's, not hearing from his men. And as, evening turns into the dead of night, he can't find any sleep. He's sitting there in the parlor of his home, which would be on modern day State Street. So it would be on kind of the southern side of town. Mm-hmm. A nice little stately home that he has for himself. He's still waiting for Lieutenant Peters to report back in, and he's trying to stay awake because he needs to respond as soon as possible. But of course, eventually sleep catches up to him in the wee hours of the morning. He's nodding off and dozing off and snapping back awake as soon as he can. And during one of these little drowsy periods, he wakes to find Lieutenant Peters there in his parlor. He's sitting there by the fireplace, illuminated by the kind of the dying embers of this fire. And of course, Captain Banker is relieved to see his Lieutenant Peters. What have you seen? What happened out there? But the figure doesn't respond, doesn't even turn their head. So Captain Banker asks a little bit more sternly this time, Mr. Peters, what is your report? And again, the figure says and does nothing, just stares into the dying embers of the fire. And then the third time that Captain Banker addresses his subordinate, in this case, the figure just vanishes right before his very eyes. And Captain Banker, again, hardened military veteran that he is incredibly unnerved by this situation. He calls his sister, who was in the room upstairs, to come and keep him company the rest of the night because he doesn't want to sit here by himself anymore. And it takes a very long and agonizing night, I'm sure, till the dawn breaks and a Oneida runner comes back to inform the captain that this party, led by Lieutenant Peters, had been ambushed and a number of people had been killed, including Lieutenant Peters. So who or what Captain Banker saw in his home that night by the fire? Was it the guilty conscience of a captain who worried about the fate of his men? Was it the spirit of Lieutenant Peters trying to come back and make one final report before his duty was done for good? We may never know.
That's a good one.
Yeah, it is a good one. It's pretty. Yeah, I like that one. We should add it to the candlelight tour. But then it wouldn't be exclusive for this podcast.
There you go. I'm going to advertise the podcast exclusive ghost story that you won't get from the candlelight tour. So go to the candlelight tour, then listen to this.
Yep. And this one's free, folks.
Yeah, absolutely. Unless you want to give me something, I'm happy with that. I mean, I'm easily bought. The bar's not high.
I can be purchased with French fries and onion rings. So.
Apparently. Just one more story to touch on, and then we can wrap things up that I just came across. So I don't know, did you have something about a disappearing Indian on one of the shores here? Is that a story you're familiar with?
I've heard that one. That's an old one, that's for sure.
So in the 1700s, Riverside Park, this is, like I said, I mentioned, was it Front Street Park before, and Riverside Park. Mm-hmm. This is where this was taking place, right? I'm going to keep talking so we can't hear your chewing as you finish your onion ring. I'm just going to keep going here. Okay, so, I think we're getting there. All right.
So perhaps not even the 1700s, perhaps even the 1600s.
Oh, okay.
Again, this is one of those apocryphal stories, so it could be the 1700s. But what we do want to understand about this period, whether it's the 17th or the 18th century, is that Schenectady is a port town, and Front Street is the street that fronts up against the river. And that's where people's attention and energy was all focused towards the river. And the trade facilitated by that river between this little trading outpost of Schenectady and the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people to the west. So you have that large confederacy out there. The Mohawks, being the easternmost nation of that confederacy, would be in constant contact with Schenectady. trading furs, and while the Europeans would supply manufactured goods and cooking pots and textiles and all kinds of stuff. It was an arrangement that for the first 100 years or so, I would say, was genuinely mutually supportive and beneficial, increasingly vital to both communities. So it was not uncommon to find Mohawk traders taking their canoes into town to stop and trade for whatever they needed, and they would provide various things from the woodlands of their homes. Particularly beaver pelts were the most prized, but anything else would do. Meats and other furs, the kind of the natural bounty that these expert Mohawk hunters were perfectly prepared to provide. So apparently there was one Mohawk who was kind of separated from the others as being a little bit of a strange individual, perhaps a little bit more aloof and kind of off in his own head than others. But he was a skilled hunter and respected by all the folks in Schenectady. Always looked forward to seeing him pull into town because they knew that he would have the finest furs and the choicest selection of goods to trade for. But like I said, this guy was a little bit of a strange case. Now, one day, apparently, he comes into town and people spot him from a couple 100 yards away as he's coming on in, and they gather the whole town because people are going to be bidding on what he has to share, or to sell, really. He's not necessarily going to share. And as he pulls into the docks of Schenectady, which would have been right there on the riverside, you got Riverside Park, as it bends around into the Binnakill, the small little tributary, which today you probably wouldn't notice, but there was dock space there as well. A quiet place to beach your canoe, beach your bateau, whatever you want to call it, and maybe do some business. So as this Mohawk man pulls into the port of Schenectady, people are clamoring amongst themselves to try to get the first dibs on what he has to offer, because they see that his canoe is virtually overflowing with a natural bounty of furs and meats and all kinds of incredible things to trade for. But this Mohawk man, strange for most times, he's not addressing any of these people. He just silently gets out of his boat. He unloads all of the things that he has in it, all this virtual fortune in goods, and without another word, he turns to the people of Schenectady who had kind of clamored around him, and he turns to them and he says that this is my gift to you, and the Great Spirit has called me to another purpose. And he gets back into his canoe, he pushes away from the land, and at this point, the people of Schenectady are concerned about their Mohawk friend here, because he's acting very unwell, perhaps bewitched, you might say. So a set of Schenectady men start heading out after him in their own boat, and despite this Mohawk man sitting perfectly still, upright in his canoe there, not touching an oar, not really doing anything, propelled by some unseen force, he moves up against the current to the west at an alarming speed. And the Schenectady men, the pursuers, can barely catch up with him. They can't even keep up with him because he's just moving at such an unearthly speed. And at a certain point where the Mohawk River bends around to the north, he goes around, the Mohawk man goes around the bend first, and by the time that the Schenectady men turn around that corner, the whole stretch of river for a mile ahead is empty. There's no sign of their Mohawk friend. There's no sign of anybody. It's as if he's disappeared into thin air. So the people of Schenectady are concerned. They keep an eye out for this guy in the next couple of years, and apparently some people see him on the banks of the river every now and then. They might see a figure dressed in the customary Mohawk clothing. But if they ever call out to this man, well, he might just turn his head, and as he sees his hailers, he just disappears without a word. Supposedly, this is the apparition of that same Mohawk man. But I don't know, folks. Your mileage may vary on that story. That sounds like an old wives' tale to me.
I don't know. That was essentially the same story I came across, the creepiest part to me is him going upriver. I imagine him just sitting in his boat with his arms crossed and like a headdress on.
It's a striking image.
It is. It's like the image I picture, and just the boat going.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you come around the corner and it's disappeared. Crazy.
Pretty wild. But yeah, again, I always wonder about that story, because it'd make that story so much easier if the man had a name, the Mohawk man, that is. But unfortunately, that name does not survive in our records.
No, I can imagine that.
No.
But I think that's a good spot to wrap up. We're just over an hour, which is where I like to generally cut these things off to make editing easier. I'm not going to lie. That's why I do stick to the hour format, people.
It's a smart move.
It
That's
is.
what I would do.
So that's a wrap on another successful edition of Ghost Stories from a Bar. Big thank you, Mike, Diana, for being on the show. I appreciate you taking the time to hang out, have some drinks, some snacks, and talk all about ghosts, local ghosts, and hauntings. This has been real fun, man.
Yeah, well, Chris, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for inviting me out here. And folks out there, if you want to learn more about these stories or more about Schenectady history in general, no ghosts need to be involved. You can come on down to our historical society. Our headquarters is at 32 Washington Avenue. You can come talk to me or come talk to my colleagues and learn a little bit about history for yourself, because that's really what it all comes down to, is becoming an active and a responsible consumer of history, and not just someone who watches the History Channel. That doesn't count, folks. That's not real.
It's not. Sadly, it's not.
No.
But be sure to like and follow all of the Schenectady County Historical Society's social media pages to keep up with everything they have going on. Don't forget to check out their website, schenectadyhistorical.com, for even more info on all the events. And anything else you want to throw in there before we wrap up?
Well, no, folks, but we look forward to seeing you all.
Okay. And, of course, thank you, Mad Jack Brewing at the Van Dyke here. And the manager, Deborah. You guys couldn't have been more nice. Thanks for the food, the snacks you sent out. Again, if you're in Schenectady, be sure to stop by here. Just check out the environment. It's definitely different than any other place you'll walk into with beer in Schenectady. And the beer here and food, of course, is fantastic. So be sure to check out the Van Dyke Mad Jack Brewing next time you're in town. Be sure to mention you listen to the podcast. It won't get you anything, but it'll make me feel good. I want to put that in there. I feel like that's an important note. And also, don't forget the discount code STORIES for uptownbeverage.com for 3% off your online orders. A huge thank you to everyone out there for checking out the show. You can, of course, follow Stories from a Bar on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at StoriesFAB to keep up with everything going on coming up on the show. Also, be sure to check out Popcorn and Pints on Facebook and Twitter. We're streaming new live episodes of that every Saturday night, where myself and some friends basically just drink and talk about movies. That's a fun time if you got nothing going on. You'll find Stories from a Bar on all major podcast platforms, and be sure to like and subscribe, and even more importantly, leave a fantastic review and share the hell out of it. So until next time, people, cheers.
Cheers.